Known for his blunt honesty, Mark Cuban never hesitates to tell entrepreneurs on Shark Tank exactly what he thinks. So if someone plans to walk into the tank with a half-finished idea, they should think twice. Cuban and the rest of the sharks have a sharp instinct for spotting anything fake. They can quickly tell when someone is simply desperate for television exposure, and that's usually a guaranteed way to fail on the show. The 9 questionable entrepreneurs we're about to discuss learned that lesson the hard way. While they came seeking fame with flimsy ideas, Mark Cuban's success was built on something very different: real businesses and real results. Cuban isn't just a reality TV personality. He's a self-made billionaire who built a massive business empire. He owns the Dallas Mavericks, the NBA team he helped transform into champions. He also co-owns a media company producing movies and television shows, and for people looking for cheaper medication, he launched Cost Plus Drugs, a company focused on making prescriptions more affordable. Since joining Shark Tank in Season 3, Cuban has become one of the show's most recognizable and influential investors. With an estimated net worth of around $5.4 billion, he certainly has the luxury of being selective. Over 13 seasons, he has invested in more than 85 companies, helping boost the show's popularity and contributing to its multiple Emmy Awards. Of course, Cubans are also risk-takers, and like any investment portfolio, his record includes both major successes and disappointing losses. Some of his biggest wins include companies like 1031 Productions, Ruggable, and Beatbox Beverages, all of which generated millions of dollars after his investment. But not every deal ends in success. A few handshake agreements never quite worked out the way he hoped. There's a reason they call him Billionaire Mark Cuban. He's the wealthiest shark on the panel, and his presence adds an extra layer of drama to the show. Among the many strange pitches on Shark Tank, few were as unusual as Ryan Naylor's presentation in 2012. Naylor entered the tank with what he claimed was a revolutionary solution to a problem most viewers didn't even realize existed. His product was a watch, but not an ordinary one. It was called the ESO watch, and it supposedly worked using something known as negative ions. For those unfamiliar with the concept, negative ions are naturally occurring particles found in the environment, but Naylor presented them as if they were magical shields capable of protecting people from positive ions produced by everyday electronic devices. According to him, this imbalance in ions could disrupt the body's natural energy field and harm overall well-being. His solution? Simply wear the ESO watch and allow the negative ions to restore your natural balance. The boldness of the idea was almost impressive. Naylor even claimed that he had already sold 110,000 watches, which immediately caught Kevin O'Leary's attention. Lori Greiner, curious as always, even suggested she'd like to test whether the watch's claims were real. But then came the moment that made this pitch unforgettable: Mark Cuban's brutal response. Cuban quickly shut the idea down, stating that the technology sounded like a joke and declaring that he was allergic to scams. Feeling the pressure, Naylor tried to recover. In a last-ditch effort to win the sharks over, he offered each of them a free ESO watch. But by that point, the damage had already been done. Cuban's strong rejection made the other investors increasingly skeptical. When Naylor failed to provide any real scientific evidence to support his claims, the situation only got worse. Then Damon John dropped a bombshell. He accused Naylor of copying the watch design from another company. Kevin O'Leary eventually said he might consider investing, but only if Naylor admitted that the negative ion technology was a scam. Naylor refused. Whether it was belief in his product or simple pride, he wouldn't back down. And so, he walked out of the tank without a deal. In the end, the company eventually shut down after disputes over the ESO trademark. Naylor later moved on to develop recruiting software designed to help businesses simplify their hiring process. Season 4 brought another questionable pitch. When Bill Lyon stepped into the tank, with an idea that initially caught the shark's attention. He claimed his company, Roar, represented the future of real estate technology. According to Lion, his website used a special algorithm capable of predicting future home values. The concept sounded impressive, almost like a crystal ball for the housing market. Users, he said, would pay $99 per month for access to this powerful prediction tool. Lion was asking the Sharks for $250,000 in exchange for a 10% stake in the company. But before he could go much further, Mark Cuban delivered the first blow. "I hate the business," Cuban said bluntly. "I'm out." That single sentence immediately set the tone for the rest of the pitch. The other Sharks weren't much more impressed. As Lion continued explaining his idea, the presentation became increasingly confusing. His target audience seemed to shift constantly, set boards, from first-time home buyers to experienced house flippers. The investors quickly noticed the inconsistency and called him out. They told him he was talking out of both sides of his mouth and accused him of lacking a clear business model. By the end of the pitch, it was obvious that Lion didn't have a solid concept, let alone proof that his algorithm could actually predict real estate prices. To the Sharks, it felt less like a groundbreaking innovation and more like a risky, unproven idea. However, he later shifted his strategy. Instead of chasing his original idea, he decided to focus on rental properties and eventually launched a mortgage company called Griffin Funding. By 2021, the company was reportedly generating around $5 million annually. But as many entrepreneurs learn, being a skilled inventor doesn't always translate into being a successful business person. Take Jason Woods, for example, the creator of the Chimera, the first electronically powered bodyboard. Woods entered the Shark Tank asking for $250,000 in exchange for a 20% stake in his company. At first, the Sharks were intrigued. An electric bodyboard that could potentially revolutionize water sports certainly sounded exciting, but as Woods continued explaining the product, the Sharks' curiosity slowly turned into confusion. The riding position on the Chimera looked awkward, and safety concerns quickly began to surface. What was meant to be an exciting recreational product suddenly seemed like it could easily turn into an accident waiting to happen. But the biggest shock came when the Sharks realized Woods had no real business plan. After spending more than $130,000 of his own money over the course of a decade developing the idea, all he had to show for it was a single prototype. There were no customers, no sales numbers, and not even a patent protecting the product. Mark Cuban eventually lost patience and bluntly said Woods was full of crap. Damon John followed up with an even harsher remark, calling it the worst pitch he had ever seen on Shark Tank. Unsurprisingly, Woods walked away without a deal. Ironically, though, the Chimera boards did eventually reach the market, selling for around $3,500 each. One thing the Sharks absolutely dislike is when entrepreneurs appear on the show simply to promote their business, rather than genuinely seeking investment. So when Adam Tash stepped into the tank during Season 7, it quickly raised some suspicion. Tash's idea was called Camp No Counselors, a summer camp designed specifically for adults. The concept was simple: give grown-ups the chance to escape their responsibilities and enjoy the carefree activities of childhood again. At first, the idea didn't sound terrible. After all, adults could certainly use a break from everyday life. Tash asked the Sharks for $300,000 in exchange for a 7.5% stake in his company. While the idea of a camp-style getaway had some appeal, the Sharks weren't convinced by Tash himself. Mark Cuban quickly saw through the pitch, saying Tash seemed more like a party promoter than a serious entrepreneur. Damon John was even more direct. He accused Tash of being a gold digger, suggesting that he wasn't truly looking for investment, but rather using Shark Tank as a free national television advertisement for his camps. Whether that was Tash's plan or not, his appearance on the show definitely helped his business. Shortly after Shark Tank, Camp No Counselors expanded to 10 cities and was featured in several newspapers and magazines. Another lesson from Shark Tank is simple. If you're pitching an idea, you need to know exactly what you're talking about, and you must have real numbers to support it. Unfortunately, Albert and Rich Amini didn't seem prepared for that reality when they appeared in Season 5. The brothers introduced RDO, a mobile app designed to connect doctors and patients through a digital platform. They were asking for $50,000 in exchange for 20% equity. Initially, Mark Cuban acknowledged that the concept had potential, but things quickly went downhill. Armed with what appeared to be a last-minute PowerPoint presentation, the Amini brothers began throwing around buzzwords like security, encryption, and social media. The problem? Those buzzwords weren't backed by any real strategy. There was no clear plan, no working prototype, and no evidence that the idea could actually work. Cuban eventually lost his patience and told them their presentation was one of the worst pitches he had ever seen. The other sharks quickly backed away as well, realizing the potential legal and liability issues the platform could create. Without a solid plan or convincing strategy, the deal collapsed almost instantly. The brothers left the tank empty-handed, and their website hasn't been updated since 2012, suggesting their LinkedIn for physicians never took off. Then came Aaron McDaniel, the founder and CEO of Tycoon Real Estate, whose pitch during Season 6 became so infamous it practically earned a place in the Shark Tank Hall of Shame. McDaniel walked into the tank full of confidence, claiming he had cracked the code of the real estate industry. His platform, he explained, would use crowdfunding to allow everyday people to invest in real estate projects, essentially democratizing the entire market. But the sharks weren't impressed. To them, this so-called democratization sounded more like a potential disaster waiting to happen. McDaniel's pitch raised so many red flags that it felt overwhelming. Mark Cuban immediately voiced his concerns, calling the idea scammy and declaring that he hated it. Barbara Corcoran, arguably the most experienced real estate expert on the panel, was equally skeptical. She described the concept as spooky. Even Kevin O'Leary, who briefly showed some interest, asked McDaniel whether he had a criminal record, highlighting just how uneasy the sharks felt about the proposal. Cuban didn't hide his frustration for the rest of the pitch. At one point, he even criticized the company's name, suggesting it sounded like a blatant copy of something else. Ultimately, the sharks were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of online real estate investments operating without proper oversight. They didn't trust the concept, and they certainly didn't trust McDaniel with their money. But later in the pitch, Kevin O'Leary decided to throw McDaniel a lifeline. He offered to completely rebrand the entire business under the O'Leary name and even agreed to provide the $50,000 McDaniel had originally requested. However, there was one major catch. O'Leary wanted a massive 50% stake in the company, far larger than the small percentage McDaniel had initially hoped to give up. To everyone's surprise, McDaniel refused the offer. Rather than accept help from an experienced investor, he chose to hold on to his struggling company. That decision essentially sealed his fate. The sharks quickly lost patience and ended the discussion, eager to move on from the pitch as soon as possible. Ironically, though, even after being rejected on the show, McDaniel's company still benefited from the exposure. Following the Shark Tank appearance, the platform saw a surge of traffic and thousands of new users signing up. Next came Van Gould and Chris Sheldon, two inventors who claimed to have found a solution to a problem they may have exaggerated themselves. They argued that modern society had become dangerously obsessed with smartphones. People, they said, were constantly staring at their screens instead of paying attention to the world or the people around them. Their solution? A product called the No Phone. Yes, you heard that correctly. In a world filled with advanced technology and endless digital features, Gould and Sheldon proposed the radical concept of a phone with absolutely no features at all. The No Phone had no screen, no battery, no apps, and no functionality whatsoever. It was essentially a plastic brick shaped like a smartphone. However, there was one upgraded version, the Selfie Edition, which simply included a mirror. Confident in their unusual concept, The duo presented their product to the sharks and asked for $25,000 in exchange for 15% equity in the company. They proudly pointed out that they had already raised $188,000 through a Kickstarter campaign, which was certainly impressive for what was essentially a novelty item. Still, the sharks were far from convinced. Mark Cuban and Lori Greiner, both known for investing in products with real-world applications, were the first to drop out. Robert Herjavec admitted he was impressed that they had managed to sell 3,100 units within a few months, but he worried that this might already represent the entire potential market. So Robert backed out as well. That left Damon John, who simply said he would feel stupid investing in something called the no phone. Finally, Kevin O'Leary summed up the situation in just one word, calling the idea poo-poo. And just like that, Gould and Sheldon's hopes for a deal vanished. Then, during the Season 7 finale, entrepreneur Manesh Sethi entered the tank with a product called Pavlok, a watch-like device designed to help people break bad habits. But Pavlok had a shocking twist. Literally, the wearable device could deliver a small electric shock whenever the user engaged in an unwanted behavior, such as nail-biting or procrastination. Sethi delivered a well-rehearsed presentation, but the sharks weren't impressed. Mark Cuban immediately dismissed the idea, calling it a scam, while Barbara Corcoran said the entire concept felt overly complicated and exhausting. But the biggest shock came when the sharks heard Sethi's company valuation. He was asking for $500,000 in exchange for just 3.14% of the company, which valued his startup at nearly $16 million. Kevin O'Leary immediately questioned how he had arrived at such an enormous valuation. But Sethi's biggest weakness was his lack of proof. He couldn't provide real data showing that the product actually worked. There were no clinical trials, no meaningful research, only studies conducted by other people about aversion therapy. Robert Herjavec even raised a practical concern. If Sethi didn't have the discipline to stop biting his nails, why would users have the discipline to shock themselves every time they developed a bad habit? Sethi struggled to respond, and Mark Cuban quickly cut him off, shouting that the entire idea was nonsense. When Sethi later admitted that the device wouldn't work unless users were willing to make it work themselves, Cuban became even more frustrated, accusing him of acting like a con artist. Surprisingly, Kevin O'Leary was still willing to make an offer. He proposed giving Sethi the full $500,000, but not as an investment. Instead, it would be a loan at 7.5% interest for 2 years. To everyone's surprise, Sethi turned the offer down. He boldly declared that he would accept a deal from any shark, except Kevin. That decision stunned the panel. The sharks erupted with frustration, and the pitch quickly collapsed into chaos. Sethi was accused of simply seeking television exposure rather than real investment, and he was quickly shown the exit. Among longtime Shark Tank fans, it's well known that Mark Cuban has little patience for scams, especially when it comes to weight loss products. Unfortunately, Barrett Jacques and Crom Carmichael didn't seem to know that when they appeared on the Season 11 premiere. The pair introduced their snack bar company called -Cal, asking the sharks for $500,000 in exchange for 20% equity. Their pitch quickly became confusing. According to their advertisements, the snack bars could help people lose weight. But during the presentation, the founders repeatedly insisted that -Cal wasn't actually a weight loss product. Naturally, the sharks were completely baffled. The product's key ingredient was something called co-leaf. Mark Cuban quickly grew frustrated. The founders' statements seemed to contradict their own marketing materials. As Cuban's questions became sharper, the rest of the sharks grew increasingly irritated. One by one, they all backed out, unwilling to invest in a product that seemed so unclear and contradictory. Robert Herjavec briefly asked about the taste of the bars, while Kevin O'Leary simply said he was out. What was supposed to be a major opportunity for exposure turned into a disaster for -Cal. Not only did they walk away without a deal, but Mark Cuban even warned viewers not to buy the product. saying he believed it was a scam. Unfortunately for the company, things only got worse after the show. Minus Cal soon went out of business. The product received harsh reviews on Amazon, averaging just 1.9 out of 5 stars. Eventually, production stopped entirely, and both the company's website and social media accounts went inactive.